Sometimes a stance seems to arrive before the thought that would justify it. Before the sentence is finished, before the other person has actually said anything worth reacting to, something has already leaned into a position, already bracing, already explaining before being asked, already backing down from an argument that hasn't started. The face across from you hasn't changed, the room hasn't changed. Whatever just happened somewhere else first. Where that comes from isn't obvious in the moment. It rarely announces itself. It just arrives fully formed, as if it had been waiting nearby the whole time. You already know the shape of part of this. You've rehearsed conversations that never happened, replayed them, corrected them, found the sentence that should have come 3 days too late. And you've considered maybe that the person on the other side of that argument was never fully there to begin with, familiar but not independent, capable of saying the things you expect them to say and little else, not capable of surprising you the way an actual person can. What hasn't been asked yet is quieter and harder to sit with. What happens to the part of you that keeps showing up to that argument? Because every time the exchange replays, you're not only rehearsing what you'd say, you're rehearsing how you'd stand while saying it, defending, conceding, bracing for an attack that hasn't arrived, explaining yourself to someone who isn't listening because they were never really there to listen. That may not be incidental to the loop. It may be the part of it most likely to stay long after the specific words of the argument have stopped mattering to you at all. A relational position isn't only posture, and it isn't only tone of voice. It's a way of entering an interaction already prepared for something specific, expecting to be misunderstood even before you've said the thing that could be misread, expecting to have to justify yourself as though justification was simply the cost of speaking, expecting to concede before the disagreement has even been fully spoken, because conceding early has always felt safer than holding your ground, expecting an accusation that hasn't been made yet and answering it anyway, expecting rejection and arriving already a little closed off so that whatever comes can't land as hard. It can mean walking in braced to defend a boundary nobody has actually threatened. It's closer to a stance the mind can return to than a category it sorts you into. Think of how specific that can get, not just defensive, but defensive in this particular shape, the shoulders set a certain way, the explanation ready before it's requested, the tone already apologetic for something that hasn't happened yet and might never happen at all. Rehearsal isn't limited to a general readiness. It may leave something more particular familiar too, not just guardedness in the abstract, but a specific way of being guarded worn into a groove of its own. Here's where it gets specific enough to notice in your own life. Picture the defense forming in your mind before the other person has said the thing you're defending against, the argument already half built in case it's needed, or the claim you were about to make, quietly softened, not because anyone challenged it, but because some part of you expected the challenge and adjusted in advance, trimming the sentence down before it left your mouth. Picture the explanation arriving before the question. "I know how this looks, but," said to someone who hasn't looked at anything yet. Or an objection answered out loud to a silence that was never actually accusing you of anything. Picture agreeing to something a beat too fast, already bracing for the version of the request that never actually arrived. Or the calm, reasonable tone rehearsed in advance for a conversation the other person doesn't yet know is happening. None of that requires the other person to have done anything at all. It only requires that something in you is already answering, not the words actually said, but the implication it expects those words to carry. That's a strange thing to notice about yourself. Responding to an accusation nobody made, defending a version of the conversation that exists only in the rehearsal, arguing with the room instead of the person standing in it. There's a difference worth holding on to here. Responding to what actually happened and entering an interaction already prepared for what you expect to happen. The first waits for something to occur before answering it. The second has the answer ready in advance, regardless of what actually gets said. Picture the same direct question asked plainly with no edge to it at all, landing on three different people carrying three different rehearsed positions. One is already defending, offering reasons before any charge has been laid. Another is already conceding, agreeing with an implication the question never actually contained. A third is already explaining, walking the asker through context nobody requested. The question itself hasn't changed. What's different is what each of them brought into the room before it was asked, worth noticing as a pattern, not treated as a law about how people are built. None of the three set out to misread the question. Each simply met it from wherever they already happened to be standing. This is the part worth being careful with because it's easy to overstate. A later situation doesn't have to involve the same person the original argument was about for a rehearsed position to feel relevant to it. What might matter more is something structural, a tone that lands the way the original disagreement's tone did. A kind of authority in the room that resembles the authority being argued with in the replay. A pause held a beat too long, the kind of silence that once meant something was coming. A flicker of disagreement, or criticism, or the particular shape of a rejection, sharing some outline with what the position was originally built to answer. None of these have to match exactly, they may only have to rhyme. Resembles is doing real work in that sentence, and it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Doesn't mean identical, doesn't mean the new situation is secretly the old one wearing a different face. Means close enough, in some structural sense, the register of the moment, not necessarily its content, that a position already familiar from rehearsal becomes one of the more available responses on hand. A stranger's tone can carry an echo of someone else's. An unfamiliar room can still feel for a second like the kind of room where you've had to defend yourself before. None of it requires the new situation to actually resemble the old one in any way a third person watching would notice. The resemblance can be entirely internal, felt rather than visible. Whether that's what's actually happening in a given moment is hard to know from the inside, worth holding as a question about your own experience rather than a verdict on it. There's a second person in every one of these moments, and what the resemblance means shifts depending on where they're standing. Whoever is actually in front of you, the colleague, the friend, the near stranger, can only respond to what shows up. They can't see the rehearsal behind it or the argument it originally belonged to. If what shows up is a defense nobody asked for, or an agreement offered before anything was actually requested, that's what they meet. Not the old disagreement, not the parent or the ex or whoever the position was first built against, just the position itself arriving in a room that had nothing to do with where it came from. Whatever they make of it, confusion, mild surprise, an assumption that it says something about them, is built on a version of you that walked in already prepared for a conversation they never started. What actually reaches them is narrower than what produced it. Not the old argument, not the version of the absent person built and rebuilt across the rehearsal, not the many times the position was returned to before this particular moment. Only the result. The defense arriving before anything needed defending. The statement already softened past what the moment called for. The apology offered for something not yet named. The agreement given faster than the request was even finished. That's the entire transaction from where they're standing, not a rehearsal, not a history, not a pattern, just this one response, this one time, arriving in a room they didn't know had a second occupant. Whatever conclusion they draw about you is drawn entirely from that narrow slice, never from everything that quietly built it. There's a related complication here. A rehearsed position may not only shape how you respond, it may also shape what you notice in the first place. If a position was built expecting rejection, An ambiguous silence might get read as rejection before it could reasonably be read as anything else. If a position was built expecting to be misunderstood, a neutral question might sound for a second like the opening move of an accusation. This isn't a claim that perception gets fabricated wholesale. It's narrower than that. What a person has been primed to expect can color how genuinely ambiguous signals get interpreted, at least sometimes, for at least some people. Whether it does, and how strongly, is exactly the kind of claim that needs more behind it than a sentence that sounds convincing. None of this is only about defensiveness. The position rehearsed doesn't have to be a defensive one at all. Some people rehearse conceding, agreeing faster than the disagreement calls for, smoothing things over before they've actually been resolved, apologizing for a stance they haven't finished stating. Some rehearse over-explaining, adding justification nobody asked for, as if silence itself were dangerous in that moment, as if any gap in the explanation were an opening for blame to rush in. Some rehearse anticipation, reading tension into a pause, treating a raised eyebrow as the opening move of a fight nobody has started, hearing an edge in a sentence that was said flatly. Some rehearse caution before anything has happened at all, entering a conversation already scanning it for the moment it might turn, unable to simply be in the room until they've located the exit from it. Whether every one of these works the same way isn't obvious. They're grouped here because they share a shape, not because they've been shown to behave identically. These aren't fixed types, and they're not meant to sort anyone into a category. They share a recognizable shape, a particular way of meeting a conversation that may become familiar through repetition, even if the mechanisms behind each form aren't necessarily identical. The same person might rehearse one position with one relationship and a completely different one with another, bracing with a parent, conceding with a partner, over-explaining at work, three separate grooves worn by three separate arguments, each one available on its own terms in its own kind of room. Consider, as one illustration of what this might look like, not a documented case, just a picture worth holding for a moment. Someone who spent months replaying an old disagreement with a parent, the same argument rehearsed until the defensive stance inside it wore smooth. Later, in a meeting that has nothing to do with that parent, a colleague disagrees a little more directly than expected, and something in that person is already braced before the sentence has finished landing. Not because the colleague is a threat, not because the meeting is secretly about the parent, because the position, the bracing, the readiness to defend something that isn't actually under attack was already familiar. It didn't have to be built from nothing in that meeting. It only had to be close enough to recognize. Picture a different shape of the same idea. Someone who rehearsed conceding, not with a parent, but with someone they used to date, someone whose disapproval used to cost them peace for days, so that giving in early became the fastest way back to calm. Long after that relationship is over, a friend makes a request that isn't really unreasonable, and this person hears themselves agreeing before they've actually decided anything. Not because the friend resembles the ex in any obvious way, because the shape of the moment, a mild demand, a flicker of tension, the possibility of disappointing someone was close enough to call the old position back into use. That's a picture of what carryover could look like, not proof that it happens this way, or that it happens at all in any particular life. Whether this kind of transfer is common, rare, or something else entirely isn't settled by telling the story convincingly. What's being examined here is repeated rehearsal, not a single stray thought that crosses the mind once and moves on. The question isn't what one stray replay can do, it's what repeated return to the same position may make familiar. No particular number of repetitions is being claimed here, and none is needed to make the point. What matters is that the position keeps getting revisited, not how many times exactly. There's another possibility here. The specific details of an old argument, exactly who said what, in what order, may become less vivid over time than the stance rehearsed inside it. It's possible for the position itself, the bracing or conceding or over-explaining, to stay recognizable even after the argument it came from has grown hard to fully recall. If that's the case, what's left isn't necessarily the memory of the disagreement. It may just be the shape once learned inside one. None of this is destiny, and it's worth being exact about what familiar does and doesn't mean. Familiar isn't the same as inevitable. Available isn't the same as compulsory. A position that comes to mind more easily isn't a position you're forced to occupy. It's simply closer at hand than one that hasn't been rehearsed. Situations that resemble the original tension may not call the position up at all. The resemblance has to land a certain way at a certain moment, and even then, nothing guarantees the old stance actually takes over. It's a tendency, not a switch, and none of this is the same as personality. A rehearsed position is a stance you can return to under certain conditions. It isn't who you are underneath everything else. The two get confused easily, because both can show up as "this is just how I am in these moments," but a rehearsed position is narrower and more situational than personality. It describes a possible way of responding under certain conditions, not the totality of who someone is. It's worth resisting the pull toward a tidy resolution here too. This isn't a mechanism with an obvious reverse setting, and nothing about noticing a pattern makes it disappear on command. Familiarity isn't destiny, but that doesn't mean it isn't real, or that it isn't worth noticing exactly as it is, without turning it into a project to solve or a flaw to correct on schedule. So if the argument you keep having isn't really about winning it, and by now you probably suspect it isn't, what is it actually doing? Maybe this. It isn't teaching you a conclusion. It's giving you practice being a particular kind of person inside a conflict. Not the person you are, a position you can occupy. And the more familiar that position becomes, the less it has to be chosen freshly each time it's needed. It can simply already be close by. So when this video's title says, "The argument in your head is quietly changing who you are," that's worth being precise about too. It isn't claiming a new personality forms in the replay, or that repetition rewires anyone into someone unrecognizable. What it's pointing at is smaller and stranger, a possible change in which responses are close at hand under conditions that resemble the one the position was rehearsed against. Not a new self arriving all at once, a quiet shift maybe, in which responses are closest at hand and under what conditions. That reframes the question this whole video opened with. Not why the argument keeps coming back, not who you're really arguing with. The question is quieter than either of those, and it doesn't resolve as cleanly. Which stance have you been getting easier and easier at reaching for? And would you recognize it the next time it arrives before the thought that was supposed to justify it? You don't have to answer that today, but it might be worth noticing the next time a position rises in you faster than the situation in front of you seems to call for. It might not be about what's actually happening there at all. It might be an old rehearsal, finally getting some use, a change nothing outside you would show, and nothing anyone else could point to and name. It would only show up in the moment itself, in how quickly the old position arrives, and how little the actual situation had to do to summon it. Which brings this back to where it started, that stance that seems to arrive before the thought that would justify it, the one that shows up braced, or already conceding, or already explaining, before anything in the room has actually asked for a response. It might not be coming from what's actually happening in front of you. It might be older than that. Rehearsed somewhere else, on someone else, in an argument that ended days ago, in a room you're not standing in anymore. The position you kept rehearsing might not know that yet,